Hi, my lovely second graders. I love you. I miss you. And I'm going to start rereading the first 4 chapters of Stuart Little to you. If you remember, we started reading them one of the last days that we were in our classroom together. And online, there is a novel study packet that you started filling out. So you need to listen to the story very, very carefully. This is testing your listening skills and it's testing your comprehension skills. Are you getting what the story is about? All right, so I'm going to reread the first 4 chapters to you. And so sit back and relax. I've got my little kitty cat here with me. See her? That's Mitsuko. Mitsuko. Yeah, that's my class, Mitsuko. Okay, got my fireplace going. It's raining outside and it's just a really nice time to kind of be comfy and cozy. So sit back, get yourself into a nice little area where you can just relax and listen. If you remember, we were on the reading rug. We're all just kind of sitting there together. Classroom community. This is just the same thing. Just the same thing. So again, it's Stuart Little. It is by E.B. White. And I'll start at the very beginning. You might remember a lot of this so far, but then we'll move on to the rest of the book. Stuart Little, Chapter 1, In the Drain. When Mrs. Frederick C. Lewis' second son was born, everyone noticed that he was not much bigger than a mouse. The truth of the matter was, the baby looked so much like a mouse in every way. He was only about 2 inches high, and he had a mouse's sharp nose, a mouse's tail, mouse's whiskers, and a pleasant, shy manner of a mouse. Before he was many days old, he was not only looking like a mouse, but acting like one too, wearing a gray hat and carrying a small cane. Mr. and Mrs. Little named him Stuart, and Mr. Little made him a tiny bed out of 4 clothespins and a cigarette box. There you can see his bed. Unlike most babies, Stuart could walk as soon as he was born. When he was a week old, he could climb lamps by shimmying up a cord. Mrs. Little saw right away that the infant clothes she had provided him were unsuitable. And she set to work on making him a fine little blue worsted suit with patch pockets in which he could keep his handkerchief, his money, his keys. Every morning before Stuart dressed, Mrs. Little went into his room and weighed him on a small scale, which was really meant for weighing letters. At first, Stuart could have been sent by first-class mail for 3 cents, but his parents preferred to keep him rather than send him away. And when at age of a month old, he had gained only 1/3 of an ounce, his mother was so worried she sent for the doctor. The doctor was delighted with Stuart and said that it was very unusual for an American family to have a mouse. He took Stuart's temperature and found that it was 98.6, which is normal for a mouse. He also examined Stuart's chest and heart and looked into his ears solemnly with a flashlight. Not every doctor can look into a mouse's ears without laughing. Everything seemed to be all right, and Mrs. Little was pleased to get such a good report. Feed him up, and the doctor said that as he left cheerily. There's the doctor checking out Stuart's ears. The home of the Little family was a pleasant place near the park in New York City. In the mornings, the sun streamed in through the east windows, and all of the Littles were up early as a general rule. Stuart was a great help to his parents and to his older brother, George, because of his small size and because he could do things that a mouse can do. He was agreeable about doing them. One day, when Mrs. Little had taken a bath, she lost a ring off her finger and was horrified to discover that it had fallen down the drain. "What had I better do?" she cried, trying to keep the tears back. "If I were you," said George, "I should bend a hairpin in the shape of a fishhook and tie it to a piece of string and try to fish the ring out with it. So Mrs. Little found a piece of string and a hairpin, and for about a half hour she fished for the ring. But it was dark down the drain, and the hook always seemed to get caught on something before she could get it down to where the ring was. "What luck?" inquired Mr. Little, coming into the bathroom. "No luck at all," said Mrs. Little. "The ring is so far down, I can't fish it up." "Why don't we send Stuart down after it?" suggested Mr. Little. "How about it, Stuart? Would you like to try?" "Yes, I would," Stuart replied, "but I think I better get into my old pants. I imagine it's wet down there." "It is all of that," said George, who was a trifle annoyed that his hook idea hadn't worked. So Stuart slipped into his old pants and prepared to go down the drain after the ring. He decided to carry the string along with him, leaving one end in charge of his father. "When I jerk 3 times on the string, pull me up," he said. And while Mr. Little knelt in the tub, Stuart slid easily down the drain and was lost to view. In a minute or so, there came 3 quick little jerks on the string, and Mr. Little carefully hauled it up. There, at the end, was Stuart with the ring safely around his neck. "Oh, my brave little son," said Mrs. Little proudly as she kissed Stuart and thanked him. "How was it down there?" asked Mr. Little, who was always curious to know about places that he had never been before. "It was all right," said Stuart. But the truth was the drain had made him very slimy, and it was necessary for him to take a bath and sprinkle himself with a bit of his mother's violet water before he felt himself again. Everybody in the family thought he had been awfully good about the whole thing. Here's Stuart spraying himself with his mom's violet water. Violet water is kind of like perfume. Chapter 2, Home Problems. Stuart was also helpful when it came to ping pong. The Littles liked ping pong, but the balls had a way of rolling under chairs, sofas, radiators, and this meant that the players were forever stooping down and reaching under things. Stuart learned to chase the balls, and it was a great sight to see him come out from under a hot radiator, pushing a ping pong ball with all his might, the perspiration rolling down his cheeks. The ball, of course, was almost as high as he was, and he had to throw his whole weight against it in order to keep it rolling. Oops. The Littles had a grand piano in their living room, which was all right except for one key that was sticky, and it didn't work. Mrs. Little said she thought it must be the damp weather, but I don't see how it could be the damp weather, for the key had been sticking for about 4 years, during which time there had been many bright, clear days. But anyway, the key stuck, and it was a great inconvenience to anyone trying to play the piano. It bothered George particularly when he was playing the scarf dance, which was rather lively. It was George who had the idea of stationing Stuart inside the piano to push the key up the second it was played. This was no easy job for Stuart, and he had to crouch down between the felt hammers so that he wouldn't get hit on the head. That's him inside the piano. But Stuart liked it just the same. It was exciting inside the piano, dodging about, and the noise was quite terrific. Sometimes after a long session, he would emerge quite deaf, as though he had just stepped out of an airplane after a long journey, and it would be some time before he really felt normal again. Mr. and Mrs. Little often discussed Stuart quietly between themselves when he wasn't around, for they had never quite recovered from the shock and surprise of having a mouse in the family. He was so very tiny and he presented so many problems to his parents. Mr. Little said that, for one thing, there must be no references to mice in their conversation. He made Mrs. Little tear the nursery rhymes from the nursery rhyme books, especially the one about 3 blind mice. See how they run. I don't want Stuart to get a lot of notions in his head, said Mr. Little. I should feel badly to have my son grow up fearing that a farmer's wife was going to cut off his tail with a carving knife. It was such things that made children have bad dreams when they go to bed at night. Yes, replied Mrs. Little, and I think we had better start thinking about the poem, "'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse." I think it might embarrass Stuart to hear mice mentioned in such a belittling manner. That's right, said her husband. But what shall we say when we come to that line in the poem? We'll have to say something. We can't just say, "'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the house not a creature was stirring." That doesn't sound complete. It needs a word to rhyme with house. What about louse? Said Mrs. Little. How about grouse? Said Mr. Little. I suggest souse, remarked George, who had been listening to the conversation from across the room. It was decided that louse was the best alternative for mouse. And so when Christmas came around, Mrs. Little carefully rubbed out the word mouse from the poem and wrote the word louse. And Stuart always thought the poem went this way. "'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a louse." The thing that worried Mr. Little most was the mouse hole in the pantry. This hole had been made by some mice in the days before the Littles came to live in the house, and nothing had been done about stopping it up. Mrs. Little was not sure at all that she understood his real feelings about the mouse hole. She didn't know where the hole led to, and it made her uneasy to think that Stuart might someday feel the desire to venture into it. After all, he does look a good deal like a mouse, said Mr. Little to his wife, and I've never seen a mouse yet that didn't like to go into the mouse hole. If you look real carefully at this picture, you can see the mouse hole right there. Chapter 3, Washing Up. Stuart was an early riser. He was almost always the first person up in the morning. He liked the feeling of being the first one stirring. He enjoyed the quiet rooms with books standing still on the shelves, the pale light coming in through the windows, and the fresh smell of day. In wintertime, it would be quite dark when he climbed from his bed, and he sometimes shivered with cold as he stood in his nightgown doing exercises. Stuart touched his toes 10 times every morning to keep himself in good condition. He had seen his brother George do it, and George had explained that it kept the stomach muscles firm and was a fine abdominal thing to do. After exercising, Stuart would slip on his handsome wool wrapper, tie the cord around his waist, and start for the bathroom, creeping silently through the long, dark hall past his mother's and father's room, past the hall closet where the carpet sweeper was kept, past George's room, and along by the head of the stairs until he got to the bathroom. Of course, the bathroom would be dark too, but Stuart's father had thoughtfully tied a long string to the pull chain of the light. The string reached clear to the floor. By grasping it as high up as he could and throwing his whole weight on it, Stuart was able to turn on the light. Swinging on the string this way, with his long bathrobe trailing around his ankles, he looked like an old friar pulling the bell rope in an abbey. Here's a picture of him. So he was swinging on that string, trying to flip the on switch of the light. To get to the wash basin, Stuart had to climb a tiny rope ladder which his father had fixed for him. George had promised to build Stuart a small special wash basin, only 1 inch high, with a little rubber tube through which water would flow. But George was always saying he was going to build something and then forgetting about it. Stuart just went ahead and climbed the rope ladder to his family's wash basin every morning to wash his face and hands and brush his teeth. Mrs. Little had provided him with a doll's size toothbrush, a doll's size cake of soap, a doll's size washcloth, and a doll's comb, which he could use for combing his whiskers. He carried these things into the in his bathrobe pocket, and when he reached the top of the ladder, he took them out, laid them neatly in a row, and set about the task of turning the water on. For such a small fellow, turning the water on was quite a problem. He had discussed it with his father one day after making several unsuccessful attempts. "I can get up onto the faucet all right," he explained, "but I can't seem to turn it on because I have nothing to brace my feet against." "Yes, I know," his father replied. "That's the whole trouble." George, who always listened to conversations whenever he could, said that in his opinion, they ought to construct a brace for Stuart. And with that, he got out some boards, a saw, a hammer, a screwdriver, some nails, and started making a terrific fuss in the bathroom, building what he was going to call a brace for Stuart. But he soon became interested in something else, leaving the tools on the bathroom floor just lying around. Stuart, after examining this mess, turned to his father again. "Maybe I could pound the faucet with something and turn it on that way," he said. So Stuart's father provided him with a very small light hammer made of wood, and Stuart found that by swinging it 3 times around his head and letting it come down with a crash against the handle of the faucet, he could start a thin stream of water flowing, enough to brush his teeth anyway, and moisten his washcloth. So every morning, after climbing to the basin, he would seize his hammer and pound the faucet, and the other members of the household, dozing in their beds, would hear the bright, sharp clink, clink, clink of Stuart's hammer, like a faraway blacksmith, telling them that the day had come and that Stuart was trying to brush his teeth. Here's a picture of Stuart pounding the faucet with his tiny little hammer, trying to get the water flowing. And now we're on to chapter 4, exercise. One fine morning in the month of May, when Stuart was 3 years old, he arose early, as was his custom, and washed and dressed himself, took his hat and cane, and went downstairs into the living room to see what was doing. Nobody was around but Snowbell, the white cat belonging to Mrs. Little. Snowbell was another early riser, and this morning he was lying on the rug in the middle of the room thinking about the days when he was just a kitten. "Good morning," said Stuart. "Hello," replied Snowbell sharply. "You're up early, aren't you?" Stuart looked at his watch. "Yes," he said. "It's only 5 minutes past 6, but I felt good and I thought I'd come down and get a bit of exercise." "I should think you'd get all the exercise you want up there in that bathroom, banging around, waking up all the rest of us by trying to get the water started so you can brush your teeth. Your teeth aren't really big enough to brush anyway. Want to see a good set? Look at mine." Snowball opened his mouth and showed 2 rows of gleaming white teeth, sharp as needles. Very nice, said Stuart, but mine are all right, too, even though they're small. As for exercise, I take all I can get. I bet my stomach muscles are firmer than yours. I bet they're not, said the cat. I bet they are, said Stuart. They're like iron bands. I bet they're not, said the cat. So Stuart glanced around the room to see what he could do to prove to Snowball that what good stomach muscles he had. He had the drawn window shade on the east window with its shade cord and ring like a trapeze, and it gave him an idea. Climbing to the windowsill, he took off his hat and he laid down his cane. You can't do this, he said to the cat, and he ran and jumped onto the ring the way acrobats do in the circus, meaning to pull himself up. A surprising thing happened. Stuart had taken such a hard jump that it started the shade to roll up. With a loud snap, the shade flew up near to the top of the window, dragging Stuart along with it and rolling him up inside so that he couldn't budge. Holy mackerel, said Snowball, who was almost as surprised as Stuart Little. I guess that will teach him to show off his muscles. Help! Let me out! Cried Stuart, who was frightened and bruised inside the rolled-up shade, and who could hardly breathe. But his voice was so weak that nobody heard. Snowball just chuckled. He was not fond of Stuart, and it did not bother him at all that Stuart was all wrapped up in the window shade, crying and hurt and unable to get out. Instead of running upstairs and telling Mr. and Mrs. Little about the accident, Snowball did a very curious thing. He glanced around to see if anyone was looking, and then he leapt softly into the windowsill, picked up Stuart's hat and cane in his mouth, carried them to the pantry, and laid them down at the entrance of the mouse hole. So again, if you look real carefully, you can see the mouse hole there. When Mrs. Little came down later and found them there, she gave a shrill scream, which brought everybody on the run. It happened, she cried. What has? Asked her husband. Stuart's down the mouse hole,